but towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And I like that. And I like that kind of approach to it. Like, so I'll start with some knowledge about it, about some, knowing who's doing it, in what forms, bringing in yourself, how can you contribute, and then actually taking action. And I like to approach them in that way, I think.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen.
Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who will introduce herself. Emma, please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me here. So I'm Emma Stenström. I'm Swedish. And I call myself a teacher first and foremost. I think that's the most important part of my identity. So I teach at a business school. I teach mostly sustainability and leadership. And I can come back to that perhaps later or perhaps not. We'll see. Of course, I'm also a researcher. I do have a PhD. I'm an associate professor. I run a research center for arts, business, and culture.
ABC, right?
ABC. We call it ABC.
Cool.
So arts, business, and culture. Come back to that for sure. And then I sometimes call myself an activist, and that is always a bit controversial. But I do take what we call here in Sweden the third task as an academic, that is really doing things and spreading knowledge to society. I take that very serious. So I am a columnist, I'm a writer, and I run a little NGO myself on the side of my more academic career. So I think that's very much me too, like moving in between different fields. I have a very academic background. I grew up in a university town called Uppsala in Sweden. I've lived in the US a few times. My dad actually 3 times. First, when I was a kid, when I was 4, I went to kindergarten outside Boston. My dad worked in Boston, so I joined him and my family there. So I did grow up. I spent 1.5 years in the US as a kid, came back to Sweden, went back as a teenager as an exchange student, this time to New Jersey. I graduated from high school in New Jersey 40 years ago. I know that because we have a reunion coming up this September. I'm still very close to my high school friends in New Jersey.
Where exactly in New Jersey?
Mendham, New Jersey, close to Morristown.
Mm-hmm. You know that I live close to Morristown, actually.
Do you?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah, this is pretty amazing because, first of all, Uppsala, right, is the name. I've been there often because of ACT Alliance. My organization is part of that, and they organize meetings. Church of Sweden is connections there. Second, you call Boston. That's where our second son lives. New Jersey is the state where I've been living together with my wife for the last 13 years. So
what's the name of where do you live in New Jersey?
In Booton, a very small town. Yeah. Since 6-7 months. Yeah.
Oh, wow. So maybe we'll see each other soon, not just a word.
Yeah, and for the listeners, we haven't met. We met through the first Inner Development Goals Summit. So that's how we connected. So, wow, yeah. Sorry, I just had to say this. This is so funny.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, next time we'll meet on the street and we say hi.
Yes, exactly.
But yeah, and I lived in Los Angeles as well. So that's my third US city where I've lived. But that was much later in life. And mostly I've lived in Canada, though, close by, not in the US, but in French Canada. I did both part of my master and my PhD in Quebec. So that's where I see myself as half Canadian, almost. Sometimes as more Canadian than Swedish. It's a strong part of my identity for sure. I've been kind of going back and forth between Canada and Sweden 30 years.
Okay.
And I think that's also very much part of what I'm doing. I think that being, I would say that in between, the international interaction, interdisciplinary work, moving between business and arts, as I said before, and for 5 years, I was a professor both at the business school and at the college or university for arts and design in Sweden or in Stockholm. So I would spend. Sometimes I would teach in the business school in the morning and in the art school in the afternoon. And that to me, that's also like it's my personality, I think, but it's also what I'm trying to do, like connecting different worlds and spheres. That my whole work, that's what I'm trying to do all the time. And I find that in between, the kind of gap in between, very interesting to be in. I think a lot of things happening in between sometimes. So that's me. That's how I would introduce myself for sure.
That's I'm fascinated by that, because I'm also intrigued by both science and the arts, and then actually also by religion. The three.
Yes.
Plato was also interested in that, right? A quick question. So, what is there a difference between students of the arts and students of business? And what is that then, if there is a difference?
I think there are quite a few differences. One, sometimes when I want to make like a short version of it, of course, it's much more complex. But the short version sometimes is that I was teaching entrepreneurship in both settings. And I would do exactly the same course sometimes, like exactly the same course. They were reading the same material, working with the same things. And they were both to come up with business, like projects, not business projects. We didn't call them business projects in the art school, but projects. But really, so this is what I want to do. How can I organize that and finance it and actually make it happen? And at the business school, it tended to be like the students would say, oh, there's a gap there in the market. I'm going to go there, and then they did like those super structured analysis and, we have all the competitors and here's the price, but that's what they had learned at business school. And the art students would do exactly the opposite. They would go like, they didn't think about the market. They didn't think about anybody else, really. They were like, I want to do this. This comes from my heart and my passion. And this is what I want to do. And I would ask the art students, so do you know anybody else doing it? And they're like, I don't know. I think I'm the only one. And I would ask the business students sometimes, okay, that's fantastic. I see that gap. Is this what you want to do? And then they would be like, oh, I don't know. I haven't thought about what I want to do. And I would always say like, I think you need both. I mean, you need to do a little bit like the structured analysis, but you definitely need to have that passion and perseverance in order to survive. So I was always like, okay, let's work together instead, let's combine these, because that's when it's really going to happen. I've been super lucky to be able to, not only with arts and business, but we have a fantastic institute here, which is also an interesting institute because it was founded not by the universities, but from outside. And they said, well, we have all these fantastic students at the universities in different disciplines, but they never work together. So let's find a place where, so it's the medical school, it's the business school, it's the engineering school, it's the arts school, also the music. school and Stockholm University with liberal arts and anything, law, whatever, and all the natural sciences. So let's have like a place where master students from all these different disciplines can come together, work together in different schools. They move around and they can take courses at different schools, but they work together. And I've been so lucky teaching there, because you walk in there and you have like, oh, this is a problem in society, a challenge. And then you get all these different perspectives and they work in groups. Okay, how are we going to solve this with, I'm like soon to become a doctor, or I'm soon to become a lawyer or a designer, or in religious studies or wherever, and then combining that knowledge is fantastic.
Yeah.
That's I think that's where I'm the happiest. So
that's great. Yeah, fantastic. I'm really fascinated, and we have always limited time, of course, when we have these podcasts. So I really would like to invite the listeners to, because I try to make sure that there are podcast notes as well. We will put there the links to your center and all the social media, so that they can start following you and reading, because you wrote articles, so there is a lot to do some research on you and understand what you're doing, and
they will learn some Swedish, because a lot of it is Swedish.
I saw that as well, because yes, I saw that as well, and my Swedish is not good enough. I thought I'm from the Netherlands, I will be able to understand, but I could not. So Emma, I would like to ask you a question that I always ask all my guests, and that is, this particular podcast is a spin-off of my 100-mile walk, a walk that I started 10 years ago to raise awareness about hunger, poverty, and injustice, and raise some money as well, because 2 years ago I was not able to walk with another person. So and the talking is also an important part of the walk. So my question to all my guests is, if you would be asked to walk 100 miles, so that in a week, so that means 15 to 20 miles a day, and to be honest, I've been so long now in the States, I don't even know how many kilometers that is, but you will be walking 6-7 hours a day. For which cause would you walk, and why?
There are, of course, many, but right now, and that is, of course, in the context I'm in, I think I would walk for somehow finding ways to deal with the integration in a much better way than we are doing right now. I wouldn't say that. I was thinking about that, of walking. I was like, almost like I'm walking. I made the very conscious decision to move. I used to live in a very privileged area in Stockholm, in the inner city, downtown Stockholm, which is privileged in a Swedish context. And I decided to move to what we call extremely vulnerable areas. They have sometimes been called even no-go zones, but that's not what I call them. It's an area where 90% are immigrants, where about half of the population are really below the poverty level, where a lot of people don't have jobs, of course, where it's a very high crime rate. It's on the news every day, and I've been following that, and I've decided about a year ago that I don't think we solve problems on an individual level, of course not. And I would like to bring thousands of my friends with me. I haven't managed. I've tried to, but I haven't managed. But I said, well, at least, moving there myself, trying to understand it much better, what needs to be done to deal with that more people are included in society. That is right now the topic I would walk for. And I don't walk for it, but I do bike almost that many hours, at least a week, to go back and forth, to live in that surrounding. I find it extremely problematic that so many people don't feel included and are not included. And I think it's a big threat to society. And for me, right now, the social divides, the income inequalities, it's on top of my mind right now. And that's what I'm working with. That's also what I'm working with in the little NGO I'm running with some friends. So that would be my cause right now. And that's, of course, also in my context. There are many others, but I'm really worried about that.
You mentioned one thing in your introduction, and it was that very often you are into action. So I'm really intrigued by that. I've always been, during my study already, something in the Netherlands we call action research, in this, or operational research. Not collecting data for the sake of collecting data, but collecting data for the sake of, okay, can we improve a situation? What can we do with that? I'm absolutely fascinated by that. But you came up with, you're using a technique or a tool, bubble hopping. Yeah.
Yes.
And so I was listening to you in terms of, you're living in the neighborhood or part where definitely change is necessary to improve a situation. Is this kind of, you putting into action, what you're preaching at the university in terms of bubble hopping, or is it related? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. It's absolutely related for sure. I think it helps me, but maybe I'm also very much into action research, and also into integrating teaching and research. That's also a very important part for me. So what I do, I have worked with this method that I call bubble hopping. It's actually borrowed from an American engineer. His name is Max Hawkins. He knows that I have borrowed his. But so that is really trying to make like a simple method and a skills training to bridge divides, bridge differences, and talk to each other, especially in a polarized society, and understand each other's perspectives and talk in a civilized way, and not necessarily agreeing, but still understanding more broadening perspectives. So the bubble hopping for sure. And I've done that with about 1,300 students now. And I collected all their stories. And so I really, I want them to break out of the business school bubble for sure. I think that's very important. I also do that in my research, in the sense that I, for example, I'm involved right now in a project where we're looking at city planning, and that's also meeting those suburbs, like the one I talk about, and the inner city, and the cities in Sweden are privileged, so it's kind of sometimes the opposite than in the US. But also like understanding and making sure that everybody feels that this is our city, this is our city, this is our place. And of course, that's also using the method. And I think it's also maybe it's. I think action research is one part of it, but it's also a part of it, like understanding it as a human being with all. And I think understanding that's, to me, has a lot to do with embodiment. Maybe there are other ways of understanding things, but I think I need to live it in a way. And of course, it's difficult to step out of your comfort zone, step out of your. I mean, I'm in a very privileged situation. I understand that, and I can never, have that experience. Of course not, because I feel like things become more complex and nuanced when you're in them. It was so easy. If I would work in that research project about bridging inner and outer city, and I only went to visit parts of the city, that would be difficult. It's much better to try to live in both places and try to understand it a little bit more. It becomes a little bit, not that I can ever, of course, understand all the experiences, but at least I feel like I can get a little bit more nuanced understanding. But maybe that's also like, I don't know. I think it's also being very I'm also very inspired by the whole idea of embodiment and embodied learning, living it.
Yeah,
so, and it all connects. And I like the whole kind of, I guess it's a holistic way of, trying to bridge things and integrate them in general. So integration, I guess, is another of those topics that are very important.
I studied at the University of Leiden, where participant observation was extremely important, right? So yeah, I resonate with what you're saying in terms of, I'm trained, quote unquote, trained around this as well. So I don't know if I'm very good. I think I'm more an armchair than anything else. But Emma, maybe for the listeners, a short explanation about what exactly bubble hopping is. Is it?
Yeah. That's like, I'm like, where I'm going to. I'm writing a book. It's in Swedish.
Yeah.
But it's coming out this fall, and I feel like I should really be able to do this in, the elevator pitch. At the same, I'm feeling right now it's like, where should I start? But the simple way. So what I usually do, like, let's put it in the context again. So what I usually do is that I would like start with talking about bubbles in general. What do I mean with bubbles? And of course, there's a more theoretical background, and for me, it's really a lot about social identities that we tend to identify, and that those groups that we identify with, they tend to really influence us in all different ways, our decisions, actions, behaviors, even like taste, whatever it is. So it's important kind of become aware of that. We all have a multiple, and we know that, and we can. So I usually start with like, okay, what bubbles do you belong to? And then, of course, it's a complex question, but it's kind of fun to start reflecting. How do they really influence you? And then, okay, so what bubbles would you be curious about? Or maybe if you have a lot of courage, you might even be like, so do you really disagree with? So you start like, okay, can you kind of try to understand that? And it could be, so when I ask my students to do that, they would jump into religious bubbles. I come back to that soon. That's very interesting, I think, from between different religions or between not feeling I don't have a religion, so let me jump into a religious bubble. They would jump between politics, of course, right to left, left to right, everywhere. It could also be places you live, a different experience. It could be different professions. And sometimes they will go, what is a criminal mind? They jump in all different kind of directions. Sometimes they actually could also go very close, but start talking about topics they've never talked about before with somebody who's close to them. So what I do is that we start talking about how this influences us, and then I do a lot of skills training. So I say, okay, but really like big, major skills training, like your pod here, listening. How do we listen? How do we respond when we listen? Do we do that a shift response, that we shift over to ourselves when we hear something, somebody tells us something? Or do we do a support response instead? And how, start noticing levels you're listening on, etc. Training listening, training to ask questions, of course. How do we, formulate questions that open up minds instead of closing them? And sharing, important part, how sharing vulnerabilities and sharing in general, but also like calming ourselves, knowing where our boundaries are. And it becomes like this. Sometimes I feel like it's, and my colleagues as well, like in order to do that bubble hopping, there are so many skills you can train, but it becomes so very practical when you're actually like jumping out. And I try to do that myself too. Trying, so especially if I get, for example, we have an election coming up in Sweden in September. And we have 7 parties in the parliament. So I will invite somebody who votes for each of those 7 parties to a dinner party. We call it the Fika project. I like to meet over a meal or a coffee. Fika means having a coffee or tea and a cake in Swedish. And then have a civilized conversation and trying to understand a bit more of each other's perspectives. And coming from, and there are, of course, in, the parliament, but there are, of course, always discussions across political lines. But I like to have it also in my kitchen and really trying to understand more, broadening of perspectives. So that is the bubble hopping. And then the very important part of it becomes also afterward when we talk about it. Can we talk about it? Can we come up with solutions, especially if you have problems? That's when it's best, I think, is that when we have a problem and we meet from could be different stakeholders, or sometimes like the project I'm working with is so interesting. It's actually the big retail owners, it's the big real estate owners, it's the NGOs, it's the church, it's the police. Now, how do we actually, and we're working on this specific city development project, but we need to understand each other's perspectives. So how can we use those skills and try to come up with some solutions together? It's all about that, really trying where we understand each other's, the needs behind, etc. So it's a skills training, but particularly in order to kind of create a more inclusive society or organization or whatever it is. But it's also super fun. That's another part of it.
Yes, I can imagine.
You
Fantastic.
walk out of those meetings. It's fantastic. Mm-hmm. And I do so one thing I do is because I teach at it's a very privileged business school. It's ranked top in the Nordic countries, etc. A very privileged place. So sometimes what I do now, I'm whispering because I'm not sure all my colleagues know, but I take my classes and then I create at weekends, I go on Meetup, which is one of those apps where you can invite anybody. And I invite them to my kitchen table again, my favorite place. And it's very often that we do have no one is born in Sweden. There will be expats and immigrants and refugees and paperless people ever, And I teach the same seminars. That's my own little also Robin Hood strategy.
Yeah.
So I teach the same things that my privileged business school students, but I do that at my kitchen table. So and it's also
great.
And that's also it brings back a lot of perspective because it's all about having these different perspectives on big topics.
Yeah.
Challenges.
Awesome. Well, one of the reasons that I'm doing this podcast is that I hope it contributes to, opening people up to all the different perspectives. Again, you don't have to agree, but actually, if you are listening, then very often there is something where you think, this is where I do agree with this person, and nobody. And it's something I've learned from the philosopher Ken Wilber, nobody can be wrong 100% of the time. So, there's always an opportunity to start a dialogue. And, the start of a dialogue is the beginning of more understanding and ultimately, maybe a better world and more peace. That's great. And I know we will continue, offline our conversation and maybe how we can more collaborate on this. Emma, you work a lot with youth, and during my walks, actually, I often talk about spirituality and religion. And it's just, I think, because it is so interwoven with walking and where you get into it, start thinking about why are we on this earth. But then when we talk about spirituality and religion, we quickly, I don't know why, we talk about the younger generation. And so, my question to you is what do you see happening among, the young people in your community and religion and spirituality? And I think especially that's interesting because still the majority of my listeners is from the US and to hear, what's happening in Sweden
Mm.
around this.
Yeah. It's an interesting topic, I think. I come from a religious background myself. My family on my father's side, and they all still very involved in church. And my father stepped out of it. He's a philosopher, and he actually decided that he was not going to raise me in the same way that he was brought up. So I was raised, we never went to church. But we always had very, very many discussions. It was interesting. So at the same time, he had it was a problematic background, and we had very much discussions around religion and etc. at home. And then I have a son who's now 26. And I didn't reflect as much as my father. And I said, well, I'm not going to, we never went to church either. And then when he was 20, he came home one day and he said, Mom, I've been going to church by myself and I decided that I'm going to join. And that is very important to me. So my father, who stepped away and then tried to take me away, and then that comes back in my son. And one of the things that I've been thinking so much with my son is also that, and I find that so interesting, is that he also has many friends who come from different religions. The day when he started saying that, what, I'm actually, I decided, I know you didn't take me to church and I wasn't even baptized or anything, but I'm going to do that myself. And then he broadened. It was so interesting, with the whole bubble hopping. He went, for example, he decided that when he was still in school that he was going to do a trip. They brought a Jewish, a Muslim, a Catholic, he himself a Protestant, and one atheist friend, and they went to Israel together. And they did like a film around that where they were both discussing their own way of relating, but also, of course, how can we create a world where different religions can exist together? So it's so he's doing that, but on a religious, bringing people together. And then suddenly the religions, actually, I've seen that so much. He has, if I compare to many others, he has friends from all different religions. And he sometimes says, I feel more close to somebody with another religion than I do with people who never reflect on any religious thing. So that's also very interesting. So it can really create that kind of foam that I sometimes talk about that. Among my students, I can see, and among youngsters here, you do see, I think, two different trends. Like, one is that at the business school, I have many students who say that, they absolutely do not. Sweden is a very secular society. They've never been to church. So when I ask them to do the bubble hopping, that many will actually say, oh, I'm definitely going to, it's going to go for religion somehow. A few of them will jump between religions, but most of them would be like, because I've never been to church. So, which is also like, and sometimes I'm thinking that also creates some tensions in society, because many of people coming to Sweden do have a much stronger religion. So that also is something to address, I think. I do see still a need also among my students. I find it very interesting that they choose to do the bubble hopping to church many, many times, and also that what they learn from that. And I think that's also actually a very, very important part. So, but I also but I, of course, I see spiritual. Sometimes when I'm a researcher, I'm a bit critical. Sometimes I do sometimes feel like they treat work as religion. I feel that they do have a spiritual need. I work a lot with contemplative practices as well in my teaching. That's also, I guess, where I bring in that side. And I see that they long for that. They need it. Also, I can also see how, as you know, some of those that they do have a religious background, although we don't talk about that in the business school necessarily, but there's similarities there and there's a need there. And sometimes I'm also worried about them having that kind of work as religion and trying to get, you know, the belonging, the community, the higher meaning, the purpose, everything at work. You know, that sometimes also worry me a bit. So I don't know. I think it's a very mixed. Now it's interesting. The secular part, of course, growing up in Sweden is strong. Definitely, like it's changing in the sense that we do it. But I can also see that now. Of course, I'm influenced because it's my son, but has been, you know, I'm like such a wonderful movement that also came with him deciding that even though my mom and dad didn't raise me that way, I'm gonna look for something else. And that actually he's, you know, Swedish state church, not state church anymore, but it's, you know, but that opened up for other too and other connections. And that I think is something we could cultivate more.
And that search for meaning and community, is that something that you have seen changing in the last 2 years? And of course I'm alluding to COVID that changed a lot of things, I think. Have you seen a change there in terms of spirituality and religion, or not? It was already happening before.
I think it was already starting before. Now, I think also it's been very different here in Sweden than in the US and other places even more different perhaps. But I lived in Germany when the COVID, the pandemic started, and I moved back to Sweden. I was shocked because Sweden has been open the whole time. You know, we never wore face masks. I've been teaching a little bit online, but mostly physical, live. We went in a very different direction than many other countries. Don't ask me if it was right or wrong. I guess we will know perhaps in the future. But so we weren't as, you know, sometimes I feel like it didn't change as much as it did in many other places. I can see that I teach a very international group of students. They've all been shocked when they've come to Sweden because it's been so open the whole time. And it's been a lot of discussions around that for sure. But so it didn't affect us as much as it did in other places. So it's a bit more difficult to say, but it's a good question. I'll definitely keep thinking about that, if that also changed it. I think definitely there is, you know, so I teach, as I said, I teach contemplative practices at the business school too. And, you know, 10 years ago, they would make fun of me. The students, when they graduated, they would always have this little show and they would have this crazy teacher who taught us, you know, some of those tools too. Now, when I walk into a class, half of them already practice meditation, for example. So that has changed so much for sure. But I'm also like, I've been working with a research around contemplative practices too. So I work also with the medicals. I like the interdisciplinarity, as I said. But I've also been working with the medical school, which is also very fun to work with, I think. And we've been doing compassion interventions in different organizations, which is another super interesting topic. Mostly for well-being and to reduce stress levels. But I've also seen, I have a colleague here in Stockholm, and he's worked also with kind of loving kindness meditations, befriending meditations, he calls them, short ones, also to bridge differences and divides. And actually, it seems to have, you know, changed a bit of the polarization in society too. So I think it all connects in a way.
Great. I'm going to accelerate a bit, because there are a couple of questions I really would like you to reply to. But I'm also cognizant of the time. The listeners know that I'm really passionate about sustainable development goals, not because they're perfect, but because I think as a world, we talked and we came up with 17 goals. Maybe there are too many, maybe not enough. But at least, we set a goal for ourselves, because we a huge group of people in the world, if not all countries, said, yes, we need to make this world more sustainable, and this is what we have to do. So if I ask you what you would like people to know about sustainable development goals, what would that be?
Oh, that was a difficult question. Of course, I teach some like, can we have 10 weeks together, please? Because there are so many different aspects here coming in. But I like to work so when I started. Now I'm going to do it. I'm going to sound like a politician, changing the subject. But so one thing. So I started a long time ago. We started with, okay, we're going to teach a sustainability track at the business school. We didn't have that. So I was a co-founder of it. And what we did, and I thought that was no, we don't have it anymore, but I thought it was a brilliant idea. And we had it for several years, was that we said, okay, start with knowledge. Okay, let's get to know about the goals. What goals do we have? What are the targets? How did they come up? How are they related to each other? Knowledge about them. And then secondly, we also need to know, we said the first semester we spent on knowing. Second semester we spent on doing, and that wasn't doing ourselves. It was really about who is doing what and how can you contribute in different ways. Mm-hmm. So what are NGOs doing? What are the big international organizations doing? What are governments doing? What's the role of politics here? What's the role of business? What's the role of entrepreneurs, et cetera, et cetera? So who is doing, in what forms, and how can they collaborate? And then the third semester we spent on being. That was really so what about you? What are your values? How can you contribute? What do you want to contribute with? And then the fourth semester was about expressing, okay, let's do. Now, the whole semester, they were doing like real projects, using all the knowledge they had, but they had to make a difference somehow, even if it was small, but towards the sustainable development goals. And I like that. And I like that kind of approach to it. Like, so I'll start with some knowledge about it, about some, knowing who's doing it, in what forms, bringing in yourself, how can you contribute, and then actually taking action. And I like to approach them in that way, I think. And of course, with some critical discussions around, as you said, they're not perfect. There are conflicts of interest, et cetera. What are the challenges on all different levels, social, economic, ecological, also existential challenges that come. But I think we need at least 2 years. And I have 2 years.
I actually really think it's brilliant advice. And because, I have different types of listeners, and some are very familiar with SDGs, they work in my sector, and others are not. And I think the first step is, try to read about it, is excellent, and what is being done about it, and then what can I do about it, myself is I think it's brilliant. So I think that's great advice. Unfortunately, a report just came out about what is the status of the SDGs. Is this the second year in a row that we didn't make progress as a world? And I think the report that just came out says a couple of things. We need more investment, which seems obvious, of course. But I met you at a summit called the Inner Development Goals, a virtual summit. And this group of people that is growing also is, well, one of the reasons that we are not making enough progress is because we did not pay attention to the skills, abilities, and capacity that you need as individuals and a community. Yeah, I'm going to ask you a difficult question again, Emma, is that, what do you think, why are the IDGs important, the inner development goals? What is actually the essence of it? Why also people should, look into those inner development goals, which, are made as a result of a survey that was done among, more than 1,000 people around the world. So.
Yes, I think the whole idea about the inner development goals is that we need to shift. We need to develop. We can't, the classical Einstein quote there, kind of, we can't, solve the problems we have created with the same level of consciousness that created the problem. So we need to, there's definitely, we need to also as humans shift, develop. That's the inner development goals, and we need to change. It's not, we're not going to solve it with the same way of relating to ourselves, to being, with the same way of thinking, with the same way of relating to each other, with the same way of collaborating or taking action or not taking action. We actually, so it's kind of like that kind of, what kind of shift do we need in order to at least have a little bit higher chance of reaching those goals? And we need to do that on an individual level and on a collective level, of course. So it's both individually, but also collectively. And it is the inner development goals, which consists of those 5 categories that I just mentioned, but they weren't very clear. But the being, the thinking, relating, collaborating, and taking action, and subcategories there, sub-skills. But it's a framework again. And it's not perfect. It's a little bit like you described, I think, the sustainable development goals, but it's a framework that can help sort out and put things we're already doing, because of course many of us are doing it already, and also that we need to do it. And I think an important part of this also comes from adult development. I teach at the university, the students graduate when they're 23 or 25 or something, but this is something we need to do throughout life and for everybody. So what's been interesting is also to see the kind of movement where we have government stepping in, and we have lots of organizations. I don't know how much time I spend talking to different organizations, corporations and public organizations, and like, how can we actually help to develop everybody who's working or who we are collaborating with or whatever? How can we help so that everybody develops, so that we together can have a little bit of a higher chance to reach those sustainable development goals? And I think it's like it's an easy framework that can help us come together. And once again, I think you did the way you introduced the sustainable development goals. I think the same way you can address the inner development goals. That it's a framework. It's not perfect, but it's a framework, and we can come together because we need to come together across the globe. So
right. No, thank you for that. And again, I will include also the link again for the listeners that they can find the inner development goals. I think you're similar to me. The art is important, and especially music for me. So the question that I always ask, if I, ask you to come up with a piece of music or a song that best embodies who Emma is, what would that piece of music be or song be, and why?
It would for sure. This is like the only thing I'm totally sure about, if you can be sure. It would for sure be something from the German composer Nils Frahm. I don't know if you heard of him.
No.
I highly recommend it. You have something to look forward to. Everybody else will put that in the link too. He's a German composer. He creates. He's very productive contemporary. I think what I really enjoy with him, he creates atmospheres with his music.
Mhm.
It's instrumental, so which I find so nice, because there are so much words all the time. We talk so much, and I said before, like the being in that kind of where there are no words with another language, the atmosphere, and he really kind of creates that kind of atmosphere where it also goes in between different states all the time. I think once I was in therapy. I was in therapy for 3 years. I went to see the same therapist for 3 years, once a week. And he had a background in music too. And every session started with that I had to pick a song that described my kind of state of mind or how I was feeling, etc. We did that for 3 years, every week. And after that was absolutely the best part of therapy, and one of the best things I've done in my life when it comes to personal development. Because after like a year and a half, you really started to see a pattern. Of course, I spent tons of time thinking about what song I'm going to choose. But after a year and a half, you start to see a pattern. And when you started to hear the pattern, and then you read that, for me, that became like the biggest insight, I think, into my emotional landscape. And of course, when I think about Nils Fromm, he's right in the middle of that, which also like it's those building up those atmospheres. It's always variations. It's never like one tune. It always goes between states, and I think that's also very typical of some. But he's fantastic. If you haven't heard Nils,
oh no, I for sure will check him out. I do have to poke you a bit more in terms of to come up with a title, because I can't.
Okay, you want to have that specific song?
To...
Yeah. Okay, I pick one, but it's difficult because there are so many good ones. But I pick one. Says, as he says,
okay.
says.
Okay, and just to remind the listeners again, there is a Spotify playlist where I add all the songs that are chosen by my guests. If you go into Spotify, you go for #WalkTalkListen, you will find all the songs from U2 to Marvin Gaye and now this particular composer from Germany as well. So thanks a lot. Emma, this goes fast, and maybe we should do another episode. But my last question to you today is, is there any last message or invitation or question that you have for the listeners?
Yeah, no, of course. We talked about the whole idea about bubble hopping, and so of course, I would like to invite the listener to also think about, first perhaps think about somebody that you don't agree with, but that you could try to meet and see if you could understand each other a bit better. So that would be my first invitation, and then to practice a little bit of those skills. I'd say, when you finish listening, why not go out and talk to a stranger, somebody you never talked to before? I think that's also a good way to practice some skills. And there's a lot of research around talking to strangers showing that we tend to think that it's going to be very awkward before we do it. And we don't think it's going to be so rewarding. But after we've done that, it's actually much more rewarding than we thought. And it's not so awkward. And most of all, we think that the other person might not find it rewarding. But if you look at the research, it's the opposite. You can make somebody's day. So Think about who you don't agree with. Plan to meet with a person. But before that, talk to a stranger right after this podcast.
Great. And yeah, I can only say yes. I think that's really great. I live now in a small town, and people still greet each other on the street, which is really awesome. Sometimes you feel like, oh yeah, I would like to have a short conversation, a longer conversation, and it really, I feel so much better when I do that. And even as you said, as a result, I have conversations with people where I know that have voted for somebody that I would never vote for. So, great. Thank you so much, Emma, for your willingness to talk with me today. We will make sure to have all the links available for the listeners in the podcast notes. Good luck with everything you do, and very important work. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for listening too. Thanks a lot. Take care.
You too.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.